really excited to be going through another series of data orientation. Um, we're really excited. For me, it was so fun to see the updated data packets and seeing how much more data is being generated through Stream Team, and also good to see so many years of like full years worth of monitoring. I think the last time we did the data packets, the COVID break was really noticeable, and now it doesn't seem so noticeable. So that's super cool. So yeah, so for today we're going to get started. Talk about the goals of the data orientation process is here to help build those baseline understanding of the relationship of water quality to geology, land use, etc. And then this is a scaffolded experience. So we'll do the data orientation today, and then we'll move into the data interpretation packets, and Isabel will hold those office hours in May and June. And then in July, we'd love to revisit those data interpretation and findings and hear from you all about what you're seeing at your sites. And we'll help stitch that together throughout the state and watershed. And then, yeah, the next thing we want to add into this year, which we didn't do in 2022, is we want to have a data use conversation. So once we establish what we found in terms of the storyline in our data, we want to move into that data use side of things. So with that, I think I've taken up enough time to get everyone on who's going to be joining the first part of the meeting. Want to give a shout out to my colleague Emma Spinelli, who you'll hear from later. We also have Michelle Hom and Max Carfree, student watershed coordinators, who are going to be helping with tonight's meeting. And then you know Phoebe and Isabel around the water cooler and the kit from all these years. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Isabel. So why don't you walk us through what we're in for today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing the screen. So thank you all so much for being here for this data interpretation and exploration meeting. Phoebe, I think you have them switched around a little bit. Amazing. Glad you all
I was like about ready to just go into her office, but yeah, we can kind of thanks.
Well, glad you all are here tonight. If you want to move to the next slide, we can chat through what the evening is going to look like. So we'll start out with some program overview, data use goals, review of water quality influencers before moving into state standards and policy, and then walking through what's in the process to get from data to data packets, what's in your data packet, some examples, and then next steps, and plenty of time for some questions at the end. So moving on. We did a little bit of this at the beginning, but feel free to have your camera either on or off. You can turn it off if you have poor connection. We'll keep you muted to reduce any feedback. Please feel free to type any questions or comments in the chat. We'll be looking at that, getting to any of them, and react if there's something you like. There's some react buttons at the bottom of your screen next to it's like a little face with a plus. Feel free to show some love or applause if you like. And you've already done introductions. So if you have any more, keep them coming. But yeah, let's continue on. So most of you all are Stream Team. As a quick reminder, the goals of Stream Team are to develop baseline water quality data of known quality that examines the relationship between land use, geology, and watershed health. Doing this through multiple parameters, chemical, physical, biological. Currently, we've got about 130 volunteers in 14 Pennsylvania counties, and this map is current state of Stream Team. Moving on, Phoebe. So you may recognize this graphic from your training. It shows the cycle of monitoring, and we've already gone through those first few steps of community interest, technical support, and study design. You all had your trainings either earlier this year, maybe last summer, or years ago. It's so wonderful to see so many of you on here from so many different teams and cohorts. You all have been collecting data and going through QC over the past months, years, and now we're on to data analysis, interpretation, and integration. So whether you're going through the data interpretation process for the first time this spring or you're a veteran, we're excited to have you here tonight. All right. So as a quick overview of the process, you all received data packets during mid-March. Now we're at the data orientation meeting where we'll go through water quality influencers and talk about next steps. In May and June, we'll have some weeks set aside for office hours, as well as the data findings meeting if you'd like to share your findings, and we can chat more about these next steps later on in the meeting as well. But now I'm going to pass it back to Phoebe to talk about water quality influencers.
Woo! Alrighty, y'all. Buckle up. So we've gone through where you are in the monitoring process. You've kind of gotten a preview into where we are in the data interpretation process. So now we're going to dive into water quality influencers. So as far as these go, so when you're looking at your data packets, when you have a chance to do that, or if you have already, these are the things that we want you to keep in mind when you're looking at your data. If there are any trends that you're seeing, if you're curious on why something is happening the way it is, these are the kind of things that you can keep in mind when interpreting your data. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, but bear with me. And if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them later. Oh, I'm going to have to advance it this way. Ah, stellar. Alrighty, so this is by no means a comprehensive list, but some of the major factors that we want y'all to keep in mind when looking at your data are some natural influencers like geology and climate, as well as some human influencers like climate change, land use, or non-point source pollution, or point dischargers or point source pollution. So we're going to go through each of these categories in more detail, but this is an outline for what's in store. Alrighty, so first up is geology. So when I talk about geology, we're kind of talking about the natural features of an area, the underlying and surrounding rocks, the bed of your stream, and geology has a huge impact on the data that you may see in your streams. Some geology types more than others, but some of the things that we can consider when talking about geology is geology will determine the soil type and thickness in your watershed. It'll determine the slopes and landscape patterns of your watershed. It'll determine how influenced your stream is by groundwater or surface water. So we'll call that the groundwater to surface water ratio in this presentation, which in turn will then determine how flashy your stream is and what kind of pollution your stream is seeing. It'll also determine some aspects of water chemistry like conductivity, pH, and temperature. And finally, it'll also impact the intrinsic suitability and limitations of land for human uses. So based off of the geology in your area, it actually has a huge impact on what humans are using that land for. And once you kind of see some of the maps in your data pack, you might be able to pinpoint like, oh my goodness, this is where this is happening, solely because of or in many reasons because of the geology in that area, which is exciting. So before I talk about in more detail things like limestone or non-limestone, I want to give a brief nod to Pennsylvania's geology in totality. So this is a simplified map. This can be sorted down into a lot more categories, but these are some of the geology types that we're going to be looking at in your data packets. And in general, we can split Pennsylvania into 3 geological sections. So in the west and curving into the north, we have the Allegheny Plateau. And that's where you're seeing a lot of your sandstones, your shales, some clay and mudstone. This is where a lot of the resources extraction is happening in the state. If we go down to the southeast, we have the Piedmont section. You see some igneous and metamorphic rock, as well as some sandstone, some calcareous. We're getting a little bit more diversity here. This tends to be the some sloping parts of the states. And then where many of us monitor is this valley and ridge section in the middle. And at least in comparison to the other 2 sections, you could see how complicated and banded this section is in the middle. And this is the Allegheny or the Appalachian region. And a lot of this banding is because years and years and years ago, when the continents collided, it kind of bent and folded this area out of shape, which is how we have so many of those complex patterns in there. But if you're one of our volunteers that monitor in the valley and ridge section, depending on how big your watershed is, you may see a lot more diversity in your geology rather than people who may be monitoring in locations that are almost entirely sandstone, like up in Lackawanna there. So this is at least a little bit of an overview on what the state looks like depending on where you're monitoring. And in the back of your data packets, there are more in-depth geology maps for county-specific areas, so something to keep in mind. But diving into something a little bit more specific, I'm going to have to move my face out of my way in the recording. There we go. So looking at kind calcareous or limestone streams. So in your data packet, although the maps in the back give a little bit more breadth, when you're looking at your site-specific pages, it's going to be split into calcareous and non-calcareous, or limestone and non-limestone. So we're going to replicate that for the purposes of this presentation, but just know there are so many different geology types that and the nuances can affect your stream. But looking at limestone streams first, limestone streams tend to have a very high groundwater to surface water ratio. So what I mean by that is these streams are going to be very, very groundwater fed. And one of the reasons why this is the case is that limestone, which is made up primarily of the mineral calcium carbonate, is soluble in acidic water. So if we're looking at, if we were to have like a cross section of, we're in a lot of limestone area here. So if you're going to look underground, the water is actually dissolving pockets underground, and you'll get areas where the water is able to flow through, which allows for spring-fed streams, which is really exciting. And one of the things that occur because of groundwater-fed streams is that the water that comes out of it tends to be relatively constant flow, relatively stable water temperature, because it's not being affected as much by sitting on the surface and getting heated up. So you'll tend to see those pretty consistent water temperatures. And because it's groundwater fed, you'll also see more of the effects of groundwater pollution. So think things like salts and chemicals. Those may be more of the influencers if you are in a limestone stream area. Limestone also has a huge impact on water chemistry. So one of the things that has the biggest impact on is conductivity values. So as I mentioned before, calcium carbonate likes to break down, and when it breaks down, it's releasing ions into the water, which is essentially what conductivity is. Conductivity measures the water's ability to pass an electrical current because of ions. So in limestone-influenced waterways, you're going to have those high conductivity values because there are so many ions being put into the water. Another fun thing about limestone that you may or may not know is that it is pH buffering. So you'll tend to see more neutral or basic pHs, so 7 and higher, because of its ability to buffer some of the acids that may otherwise be entering a waterway, in comparison to a shale waterway where you may be seeing some of potentially more acidic waters because it's lacking that buffering. And then, of course, land use comes into play. Our limestone landscapes tend to have thicker soils, and it'll cater more to agriculture and development. It's also areas where we'll have lower gradient streams, lower velocity streams, simply because of the way that the land is formed around it. So that's a couple fun things about limestone. But to further exemplify some of the effects of limestone, this is a data set that was collected by the Conneauta-Gwinnett Creek Watershed Association in the early 2000s. Shout out. And so what we wanted to show through this graphic here, which shows temperature over time, is if you're going to look at it, we have blue data points that were collected from a non-limestone stream and red data points that were collected from a limestone stream. And the differences, the highs and lows that you're seeing here is because of seasonality. So you're getting the higher temperatures in the summer, cooler temperatures in the winter. But what I wanted to point your attention to is that our red line, which is our limestone stream, has much less variability. Before I mentioned that limestone streams tend to be more temperature stable, this is like the relative stability here rather than the high arcs of our non-limestone is likely due to that the groundwater influence here. So it's always awesome to see some of the things that theoretically we know come up in the data, which I'm excited to see y'all's data too. Something else that's fun about limestone streams is there's some unique flora and fauna that's associated with your waterways as well. We'll have some calcium-loving plants that grow in your waterways. If you've gotten into the stream and done a macro kick or a macro collection, you'll see mainly like isopods, amphipods, and crustaceans rather than things like mayflies or stoneflies. You'll get their sow bugs and scuds, which are on the screen here. And then because our limestone streams tend to be more temperature regulated, some of them are cold water fishes streams, and what loves cold water are trout. So you'll also have some cold water preferring fish as well that you'll see in our limestone streams. Alrighty, so that was a little bit of a whirlwind on our limestone or calcareous streams. Now let's look at our non-calcareous. So again, this is more of a generalization. There are so many geology types that fall into this, but this is kind of what it looks like in contrast to our limestone streams. So rather than being groundwater fed, a lot of our non-limestone streams are actually surface water fed. A lot of, and these will be things like our sandstones and our shales, things, especially shale. It's such a dense and non-porous rock that things really can't seep in through it at all. which is why you'll get a lot of surface fed water here. So think runoff, high water, it's flowing over the surface, going into their waterways, and that's the main source of that water. Because of that, it is highly affected by runoff pollution rather than our groundwater pollution. Again, for water chemistry, it doesn't have the same kind of temperature or pH buffering. So you may see more variation in that temperature and more variation in that pH that could be influenced by other things aside from geology. Land use wise, we have thinner soils. And then I split landscape into two separate sections because there are distinctions between our sandstone and our shale streams. So depending on where you monitor it, whether or not you know this, or you may be able to then visualize it in your head. For sandstone streams, these are frequently going to be the ones that are going to be kind of at the top of the mountain, usually in forested areas. Sandstone is silica, it's like quartz, does not like eroding, which is why it tends to form the tops of things. So you'll have those rockier streams, the steeper streams, the faster flowing streams, really good ones for macro collection. And then whereas your shale streams tend to be lower slopes, lower velocity, and more of your muddy and rocky. So let's move on. So these are data sets that our founder and science advisor, Candy Wilderman, created for the last data orientation meeting, but they were so good that I wanted to use them again. Box and whisker plots, if anyone is familiar with them, can tell you so much information, but what I want to focus on here, or what you need to know, at least for this example, is that when a box and whisker plot, can you see my mouse? Or is, oh, spectacular.
Yes.
All right. So when a box and whisker plot is narrow like this, it means that there is not a lot of variation in the data, versus if they're wide like this, it means the data is it just varies more. So what we want to look at here is we're looking at the influence of geology on conductivity. So these are sites along the Conneauguinett Creek. And if I first bring your attention to this top left section, we're looking at 3 limestone streams. And as we expect, based off of what we just talked about, these are the ones with the highest conductivity. So these are the ones that are going upwards of 700. And because they are groundwater fed, you aren't seeing a lot of variation. So all the things we just talked about are kind of being exemplified in the amount of conductivity, how high it is, as well as the lack of variation. Whereas if we move to some of our mainstream or mixed geology streams, we're starting to see the variation that's associated with our non-limestone. The data varies a lot more, and it's not as high because it's not just limestone fed. The one exception, however, is this highly urbanized tributary, which falls in the middle here. And we'll talk about land use soon, but that could be another reason why conductivity levels are so high. So when you're looking at your data, don't land on one thing before you've looked at the whole story, because there could be more than one reason why you're seeing high conductivity levels or whatever parameter you're looking at. And then finally, at the bottom here, we have our shale stream. And again, I mentioned shale does not like breaking up. It is not releasing ions into the water. So we are seeing no effects of our limestone here, which is why one of the reasons why we could say that the conductivity levels here are so low. So in our data, we could see the effects of geology, which is super exciting. And then just one more. Instead of looking at conductivity, we're now going to look at water temperature. And again, I just wanted to exemplify the fact that in our limestone streams, these box of whiskers are a lot smaller than our mixed geology, because again, you're getting that temperature buffering from it being a groundwater stream. This super narrow one here is, I think, exclusively a limestone stream in a really pristine area. So almost entirely its temperature, at least from our last data interpretation, we were brainstorming that it could entirely be because of groundwater, whereas these may have some other influencers affecting them. But so cool to see some of the science showing up in our data here. All right, that was a lot on geology, and we are now going to move into climate. So climate, again, a super big influencer on y'all's data. It'll determine the complex flow patterns in streams, so precipitation, evaporation, groundwater recharge, runoff, water cycle, hugely involved with climate, of course. We'll have the temperature of streams. You'll get those higher temperatures in the summer, cooler temperatures in the winter. Ecological composition, we have critters that like certain weather patterns or in temperatures and others that don't. And then the rate of weathering, so how quickly our geology is eroding. And then, of course, cannot talk about climate without at least giving a nod to Pennsylvania's history of acid rain. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but due to the high concentration of urban areas in the Northeast, there was a lot of air pollution, and one of the pollutants being sulfur dioxide. These air pollutants would bind with the rain, making it acidic, and when it fell, it would affect soils and waterways. So if you were to look at long-term data sets, you may see the effect of this acid rain on your waterways. Thankfully, this was mostly remediated by an amendment to the Clean Air Act in 1990. It's good to see a little bit of a success story here. But yeah, couldn't go without giving that a nod. But moving on now, so climate change. So now moving into some of the things that humans have had an influence over or control over. Climate change can threaten aquatic ecosystems, of course, through increasing stream temperatures. Again, I mentioned before, trout love cold water. They rely on it for their spawning and their survival. As stream temperatures warm up, it might not cater. They might not be able to survive as well in it. That can go for other animals as well. It'll alter stream flow through due to drought and increased storms. And I am not saying that the storms we've been getting these past few days have been because of climate change, but we can expect a lot more rain like that and droughts in the future. I know it's been quite soggy here in Carlisle. And then it'll worsen other stressors, increase storm runoff, which increases nutrients, pollutants, sediment, all of the things that our Chesapeake Bay is trying to reduce. So not good, which of course then can affect ecosystem health. And one of the absolute incredible things that comes out of the data that you're collecting, and one of the wonderful things about the fact that you're collecting monthly monitoring data and baseline water quality data is as you get long-term data sets, you may be able to start seeing changes over time as we go on. So another very, very important use for data. Alrighty, now transitioning into land use. So land use is a non-point source pollution. So when I say non-point source, we can't walk outside and point to the location where this pollutant is coming from. This is, think stormwater and runoff. We really can't pinpoint what polluter it's exactly coming from. And land use will, of course, affect stream chemistry due to the runoff of pollutants like fertilizers, animal waste, herbicides, oils, gasoline, organic waste. So many things that'll run into our watershed. And a lot of the pollutants that are going into our watershed are very dependent on the land use of the region. So as you look into your data packet, again, you'll have on your page, on your site-specific page, you'll have pie charts for land use, but in the back of your data packet, you'll have maps like this that'll show in more detail. But a lot of the pollutants going into your waterway will be very dependent on the land use in your watershed. Additionally, it decreases land permeability due to compaction, especially in areas with a lot of construction or urbanization. It's compacting that soil, which stops water from being able to infiltrate into it, which isn't ideal. It'll change the groundwater to surface water ratio, which can, of course, affect flooding. So a lot of things that can happen there. Stream ecology can change due to the removal of riparian buffers and forested zones, which, of course, can also then contribute to temperature changes in your waterways because it's lacking shade, and urban areas tend to have also the urban heat island effect or regional heating. That can affect our waterways as well. So something to keep in mind if you're in an urban area, especially. So when thinking about land use, we have this lovely table that shows how different land uses affect some of the parameters, not all of, but some of the parameters that y'all are monitoring for Stream Team. And if I bring our attention here to primarily nitrate, nitrogen, and conductivity, these are really the ones that are being affected by agriculture and urban and suburban environments. Agriculture more severely with nitrate, nitrogen, or our nutrients and our conductivity here. And if we went down to turbidity and transparency, again, these are being affected by our land use, especially if we're thinking of sedimentation and erosion in these areas. When it comes to pH, we're seeing more of those effects of acid deposition, acid mine drainage. So if you are in a region where that is one of the factors for your data, keep that in mind as well, even though we're not addressing that quite as much in this presentation. And at this point, y'all know I love my graphs. So I wanted to show another example on how some of these influencers are showing up within our data. So these are 3 different sites, and what we're looking at here is the relationship between land use and conductivity. So first, bringing our attention to this Lackawanna site, Leggett's Creek. If we look at this pie chart here for land use, which if you've looked at your data packet, you may have seen something familiar. What we're looking at here is a site that's almost 50% natural area, so almost half of its watershed is natural. we're looking at 20%, 28% developed and 18% agricultural. If we went down here to our conductivity levels, we are seeing super high conductivity, upwards of almost 1,000, with the lowest being 356, which is still quite high. So we're seeing quite high conductivity values at this first site. Now moving over to Luzerne, if we go to Abraham's Creek here, we have relatively the same amount of natural area. However, the difference here is instead of 28% developed, we're now looking at 5% developed. If we're now looking at conductivity, the max conductivity is 208, which is even lower than the minimum conductivity for our first site. So one of the things that we can look at here is, oh, maybe the amount of developed land here is really affecting our conductivity levels. If we are now going to go to Kitchen Creek here in Luzerne, there is only 1% developed and almost entirely natural. And I don't think I've ever tested a water sample with conductivity levels this low. We're looking at a max of 50. So if we were to look at these three data sets, one of the things that we could attribute the conductivity levels to could be land use, because we're seeing such a drastic change in conductivity. So and one important thing that I forgot to say at the beginning are all three of these are non-limestone sites. So all of these conductivity values are not being affected by the release of calcium carbonate. So it is not a factor in these numbers. So since we know it's not geology, one of the things, again, that we can potentially point this towards is our land use. Alrighty, last slide on my part. So we've talked about non-point source pollution. We're now going to transition into point source pollution. So instead of it being kind of ambiguous, not exactly knowing where the pollution is coming from, we know where this pollution is coming from, because in many cases it is a pipe coming out of the side of a stream. So these point dischargers can include wastewater treatment plant overflow pipes and pipes draining from industrial properties. These drainage pipes must be permitted under the Clean Water Act. And these permits will give you the amount of flow that's allowed to be put into the stream, as well as the concentration of pollutants that are going into the stream. And while the actual discharge is being monitored by the company, these permits can be accessed online. So if you know that you have a discharger upstream of your site and you're curious on what's going on, you can access this online and include it in your data interpretation. And then finally, because of the inherent nature of a pipe discharging things into your waterway, it may impact the water chemistry of your site as well as the flow of the stream. So again, this was by no means a comprehensive list of influencers, but if you're curious about something else that we didn't list here, include it in your data interpretation. It's really, it'll be interesting to see what nuances you could bring in based off of the knowledge that you have about your site. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to talk about state standards and policy.
Oh my gosh, did someone say state standards and policy? Okay, yes, I'm really excited that we have Emma Spinelli with us today, who is a political science major, also first year Alarmy watershed coordinator. And actually, Emma's gonna get us started on this. So let's go to that next slide.
Thank you. So for an overview of the Clean Water Act, it sets out that it wants to try to maintain and restore the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the country's waters. So we can go to the next slide, and it kind of goes into a little bit more depth of the goals that it tries to set out. So one of the main goals is classifying all water bodies for their optimal use. So there's from that, they get to designate uses for existing uses and importance of what needs to be protected. There's action to minimize degradation, and then also just making sure that we are protecting and supporting those uses, as I mentioned before. So from there, the Clean Water Act has federal state requirements. So the sections that I have on this slide kind of like delve into the main components of it that correlate with what our volunteers are working with. So Section 303C requires states to adopt water quality standards by creating criteria for the state that goes along with designated uses. And then from there, that connects to Section 303D, where based on water quality standards, we'll see if waters are threatened or impaired. if they're not supporting their uses. So impaired waters would go on the 303D list. This then goes hand in hand with the 305 B section, which culminates in a report that goes to Congress every other year, talking about the health of all waters. And then 303D and 305B go together into an integrated report that basically streamlines the process, categorizes where waters are at. And then section 319, the last one that we'll kind of go over, requires states to have assessments on non-point source pollution problems. So from that, there's watershed-based plans and best management practices that can go into place.
Woohoo!
So I'm ready for the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so first we'll touch on 303C. So this is where the water quality standards come into place. So there's water quality criteria based on different parameters. So Phoebe went over some of the parameters, and there's definitely like parameters that you guys are familiar with from your data collection that you do. So based on the criteria, we can figure out if, like I said before, the designated uses are being protected and supported. So there's different designated uses that you might see in your site profiles. So that could be public water supplies. Often it's protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, which is aquatic life uses. So you see the designations of warm water fishes, cold water fishes, which are pretty common, and then migratory fishes and trout stocking. And then as the final part that it kind of puts all together, there's anti-degradation requirements for specific critical uses of specific waters, such as ones that are designated as having exceptional value or high quality. So ready for the next slide. Okay, so for PA, what it's done with this is in the PA code, chapter 93, we have our state's water quality standards. So there's the general criteria and specific criteria. We can see the specific criteria on this slide. So you can see the parameter, criteria, and critical use that it mentions. But basically it talks about the non-point source and point source pollution, that like the targets of what we want to get under for allowable pollution limits. So we can go to the next slide. So this ties into 303D, 305B, and then the integrated report. So impaired waters that we find based off of the 303D list can then come together, and with the 305B report highlighting on the health of all waters, we can get the integrated report. So we can see a couple of visuals kind of putting that more into context that we can see, especially at the bottom, we get to see the impaired waters in the state. So you might recognize some of the streams that you guys work with. Okay, so looking more at a stream team context, we can see the impairments specific to the state. To stream team, sorry. So there's 41 total impaired waters, and the majority of these are aquatic life use designations. And out of that, a lot of them are tied to agriculture or urban runoff. So we can see the sources of the impairments. But along with that, there's 11 impairments of recreational uses, largely tied to pathogens, and then 1 designation of fish consumption uses.
And also, I just want to like highlight with this slide that Emma spent some time with the Excel files that were behind the GIS maps that highlight the impaired waters, and that's how we got this information. And then she created all these stats, which I think is super cool and fun to dig into. So we'll be sure to share these slides so you all can like take a look at this in comparison to your sites.
Okay, so yes, I'm ready to move forward. So the last section of the Clean Water Act that we interact with is section 319. So as I mentioned before, it creates assessments for non-point source pollution for the state. So that's where total maximum daily loads come into place. Total maximum daily loads, which is a handful to say some of the time, so we also call them TMDLs, are like basically the pollution diet, or the maximum amount of a pollutant allowed in a water for it still to be supporting what it needs to be. And then that helps to determine targets for where we want to get under. So this is where the data comes in that you guys provide. It's really helpful to be able to see where we're at and then determine what needs to be done. So also with development of TMDLs, it considers point source and non-point source pollution. So it kind of comes all together. Okay, next slide. And then a lot of the basic structure from Section 319 of the Clean Water Act is applied to the Chesapeake Bay. So for the Chesapeake Bay, it had been identified as an impaired bay region, impaired waters, and Executive Order 13508 during the Obama administration put into place declaring the Chesapeake Bay region as a priority of the country for cleaning and restoring waters. So in 2017, there was a midpoint assessment of where we stood with pollution load reductions and restoration efforts. And there's an end goal of 2025 that we are trying to meet the TMDLs. So down on the bottom of the slide, we can kind of see the structure that, thank you, that follows this. So there's watershed implementation plans where watersheds come together to kind of decide best management practices, what needs to be done, and what the issues are. Then to supplement this, there's 2-year milestones that basically track the progress of where we are for Bay goals that need to be reported to the state and to the EPA. And then county action plans kind of help to fill in the gaps that are created. So especially within the Chesapeake Bay region, high sediment pollution, nitrogen pollution, and phosphorus pollution are big issues. So the structure that's in place kind of helps to monitor where we're at and what needs to be done.
Nice. Okay, can we just like pause here and give Emma a nice round of applause? Let's see some reactions. So we're really excited. Good job. You're getting some reactions in the chat. Loving it. Thank you. All right. Well, so that's like helping to frame the Clean Water Act as it applies to the region. But let's go ahead and start moving into the next couple of slides. So when you go to the Pennsylvania Chapter 93 website, there's a couple of tools and tricks to help identify your water quality designation, and then that will help you see the correlating standards that correlate with that. So one of the things we have on this map here is we want to think about things like your watershed address. The first category that it breaks it up with the designated uses is by the major river water basin. So on today's call, we have Allegheny River would start for the Conowongo Creek, I believe, right, Liz? And then everyone else will be in the Susquehanna. So you would start Susquehanna and then you would go to the next size watershed from there. So a lot of folks' creeks and watersheds are flowing directly into the Susquehanna. If you have a tributary that's going into another tributary, then you're going to back it up. So we have the Conowongo circled. So we don't have our Letort Spring Run monitors on, but if you were a Letort Spring Run monitor, you would go Susquehanna River, then Conowongo Creek, and then the Letort Spring Run. Or in the case of some other folks on the call, you would work that back based on your subwatershed. So think of your watershed address, and as you're flipping through the pages of the code, you'll find your stream eventually. And a little known fact: the number of deer creeks, fishing creeks, trout runs in the state, there's a lot of them. So you really do have to start with like your major watershed and then your subwatershed. Just a little side point. One day I'm going to have someone research the number of fishing creeks and trout runs in the state. Let's go ahead and go to that next slide, Phoebe. So here, once you've gotten to the point where you're seeing your creek, we don't have the Glimes on tonight, but they monitor the Bermudian Creek. And you can see where it's underlined here in green. They're on the main stem. They've got York County. And then all the way over on the right, you see its designated use. So like what Emma was talking about, Pennsylvania has its own unique system. A lot of states do 1 through 4, A through D, and we have warm water fishes, and we also have migratory fishes listed here. All right, so that's how you would find that information. But fortunately, we can create maps, and we can have the metadata in Excel sheets behind the maps that we've pulled into your data packet. So go team, go. Let's go to that next slide, please. So once you have a sense of, your designated uses, then we can start thinking about those water quality standards that are connected to that. And just to remind us of the main designated uses that Emma pointed out, we have exceptional value, high quality cold water fishery, warm water fishery, and migratory fishes, and some recreation in here as well. So let's go to that next slide. So when you look at the state standards, it's important to note that not all parameters that we monitor and not all parameters that we like to look at for water quality assessments actually have a state standard. So when you look at the parameters monitored by Stream Team, so we have state standards for pH and temperature. There is not a state standard for nitrate. There's also not a state standard for conductivity. So with nitrate, we can at least use the drinking water standard as a surrogate. So that's 10 parts per million. Some of us might get a little nervous about nitrate when we start getting above 5, but there's no state standard to compare that with. Also, just a little known fact, there is no state standard for nitrate nitrogen across the country. Anyway. And then with conductivity, there's no standard. A lot of states will use total dissolved solids as a standard for that. We don't have that here either. But given the geology of our creeks, the typical ranges that you see in freshwater streams is 0 to 1500. And then, with like water clarity and stage, there are no state standards for that either. So let's keep going. So if you are curious to see, these biennial reports, as Emma was saying, the 303B, 305B, 303D, it requires the state to put together these biennial reports. And so we'll drop the link here of where you can find the story map to find, and determine how your creek is doing. Okay. And with that, and we already had such a great conversation about impaired uses. So you'll notice that over 50% of the streams, or close to 50% of the waterways in Pennsylvania, are listed as impaired. And just a little note, this came up in our last data orientation meeting. A lot of our cold water streams are not meeting the temperature designated use. And that's an active conversation that we've had with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So we've highlighted that we're seeing that. So I'm really curious down the road if we'll have a climate change reason for why streams aren't meeting their designated use. So stay tuned for that. We did submit data in for the biennial reports. The Clean Water Act does require the states to assemble and review all collected and submitted data, including, and specifically the 1987 amendment says this, including data collected by members of the public. So we did submit that this past summer before the June 30th deadline. And so we'll be curious to see what the next report looks like. And with that, we're handing it back over to Isabel.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for that, Jules and Emma. That was fantastic. All right, so we're going to move into now talking about the data to information process. So I'll go through how we get from collecting data to interpreting and then sharing data stories. So next slide, Phoebe. So this slide and screenshot should look at least a little familiar to you all. That step after data collection, is uploading to the Chesapeake Data Explorer if you all are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So that little bit on the left there is the data entry screen. So thank you all so much for entering your data through 2023. Give yourselves a huge pat on the back. Well done. And then this other image on the side is what data looks like when you downloaded it from the Data Explorer. So anyone can go in, anyone can access the data that you've uploaded. And when they query and download for a site, that's the form it looks at. And you can see it looks a little bit strange, a whole bunch of codes, a whole bunch of spaces. Could be a little bit difficult to look into at first, which is where our next step comes into play. So getting data ready for graphs and cleaning during this step where with the raw data, we utilize an R code. And I have a huge shout out to the watershed coordinators who developed this over the past couple of years. So Nudrang, Prerna Patil, and Michelle Cow put in a tremendous amount of work and did a fantastic job streamlining and standardizing both the data cleaning process, which is when we check for precision errors, data entry errors, unit area errors. We're all human, so this code helps us catch any mistakes we might make, as well as prep it for the next step in the process. So I have a screenshot here that shows a little bit of what that code looks like, as well as what the raw data looks like once it's run through. So you can see it's in a totally different format. But then it is primed and ready to go for the next steps. So this includes creating summary statistics for each site. So using your data to calculate the minimum, smallest value within a data set, maximum, which is the largest, the median, essential value ranked from lowest to highest, which really minimizes the importance of outliers. So if there is a huge outlier, the median will be much more of a center value and will have less weight as compared to an average. So we'll take those as well as the range and average, and you'll see those in your data packets. So once those summarized data are created, there's a final step as well, where we'll use the raw data, the summarized data, everything to create graphs. So the graphs this year look a little bit different than maybe if you did data interpretation last time around. You can see those points represented by the blue dots. We also have lines in between them to better show patterns. So it's not necessarily a trend line, but it helps visually connect the dots a little bit. The parameter is on the y-axis there. We have graphs for each of the 6 parameters that you all measure, while time is on the x-axis. And so that R code is what created those summary statistics, is what created those graphs. And truly, it is incredible and did so much to streamline the behind the scenes process. So now that we have all these components, this all comes together to create your data packets. So this next bit, I'll be talking about what the data packets are like. So back in March, I shared PDFs and I shared the link again in the chat. You can see them through the Stream Team Exchange. So you all should have data packets for each county. So I'm going to take a minute to orient you to the data packet. And right here, we get started with the site locations. So it includes all the sites in the county. They're numbered in relation to the major roads, major areas. And we have info comparing each site number to the name and site ID. There also is a site overview for every single monitoring site. So you can see here, it includes the site highlighted on the map, as well as some information very specific to each site. So this includes the watershed size, the designated use that Emma and Jules were talking about, as well as impairments, the geology and land use for the site. And these were calculated using watershed delineations. And so by taking the topography of the area, the digital elevation model, you're able to use that to create a stream network and layer on the specific coordinates of each site and use that to create a watershed for that site specifically. So you can get a lot more specific values as compared to like the general like HUC 12s or 10s that you might see. We can get really into the nitty gritty, and that's how this information was calculated for each of your sites. So in addition to that overview, we have your data in graphs. One graph for each of the 6 parameters. You can see them all here, and you'll have the chance, you can dive into them even more during the packets. And in addition to the graphs, we've included raw data and summary statistics to supplement as well. And then the last component that we've included are supplemental maps for the whole county. So everything from monitoring site locations, subwatersheds, which I just mentioned, land cover, geology, impaired streams, and designated uses. So all of the tools to scale from very small from your site into how it relates to the entire county, and hopefully put it in the broader context of these watersheds as a whole. So now we'll go into some example interpretation. We've got all the pieces now. Here's how it begins to come together. And there are so many stories for each site, so I'm going to highlight only a few, and I need to leave something for you all. So we're going to get started with Willis Run. So it's located right in York. You can see right there, it has a tiny 3 square mile watershed. And that primary land use right there is development. You can see all of that red. And so as you might expect, you can see that it's impaired for aquatic life from urban runoff and habitat modification. Let's go into the data. So there are so many stories to pull out. I'm going to focus really on conductivity this time. And you can see that these conductivity values are really high. And that's, for a variety of influences. It could be the urban that's contributing to that as well as the geology. It was primarily a limestone stream. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that dip down in conductivity, like in the summer of 2021, it looks like that really drew my attention. And so my first thought is to now go into the raw data and see if I can figure out when exactly that is and what might be the story behind that. So you can see in the raw data that value is from August of 2021, and it is very much the minimum. You can see it's 200 as opposed to those higher values. And so really, I was curious as to what might be going into this. I know a lot of the time there's a relationship between flow and conductivity. And unfortunately, we started measuring stage, a year later. So I don't have stage measurements that I can refer back to. But if you go back to those data sheets and the qualitative parts at the beginning where we talk about what the stream flow looks like and the weather conditions, the color of the water, I can piece together some things from there. So I can see that the stream flow is really high. It rained all day. The water is brown. And this person added the rainfall within the last 24 hours was 50 millimeters, which is almost 2 inches. So no wonder it looks like that. My guess is that it's very geology influenced, and the extra water would be diluting all of those ions and lowering the conductivity there. So we have that interpretation. Let's go into one more as well. So let's talk a little bit about the South Branch of the Codorus Creek. This is a larger watershed as compared to Willis. It's got about 50 square miles. It also has quite a different land use, much more agricultural, much more natural, a little bit less development. As you can see that it's not in downtown York, it's a little bit farther out. You can also see that it's mostly non-calcareous, so non-limestone stream. So I also wanted to look at conductivity for this because it's very much in my brain right now. But you can see that conductivity is much lower compared to Willis Creek in about like the 200 to 300 range. And that could be also for a couple of reasons. So we saw that Willis had was very developed, was limestone, while the South Branch of the Codorus is very much the opposite. It's more influenced by agriculture and is a shale stream. So I would expect it to be a lower level like that. And so, lots of stories in this area. I'm really focusing just on conductivity in these two examples, but by focusing on a single parameter, just like that, you can see how all of the different influences will come into play, and that's reflected in these data that you've collected. And so really, if you get to dive deep into each parameter and each influence, there are so many stories to tell, and I am really excited to see what you all have. So I think so this ends sort of the presentation part of this section. Thank you all for sitting tight. It's been a little while. But yeah, I was wondering if you had any initial questions about the process or about something you've seen. Later on, ooh, that's a really good question, Bethany, in the chat. How do we correct a data entry error once it's published? So once it's published, with the way your accounts work, you don't necessarily have access to edit data. But if you find an error once it's published, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be able to go back in and change it. And as we've been correcting errors as we go through, we've also been trying to go back into the Data Explorer and make sure the things that we find in our data packets and getting that all settled up reflects the data that's on the Chesapeake Data Explorer. Yeah, Elise.
Hi. So I have a slew of questions, but most of them are just like information and it's stuff I could look up, specifically with regard to looking at all the factors that might play into the chemistry of our sampling sites. I'm curious whether presence or absence of wildlife can affect stream chemistry, either by constructive or destructive activity of animals, and whether invasive flora can affect stream chemistry. So that's question number one. Does wildlife and flora affect stream chemistry?
Jules, would you like to take that?
Sure. Oh, that's a really great question, Elise. Thank you so much for asking that. We have not seen a correlation between like invasive plants and the parameters that folks are typically assessing in stream teams. So we haven't seen a correlation there. I'm not sure of any examples with other parameters either, but that'll be a good thing for us to look into, Elise. And then in terms of like wildlife we're not quite as concerned with, especially you're not going to see like nutrient influences as much unless you happen to be at a park where you're having a lot of ducks and geese, which I may or may not be citing a local park here. So sometimes you can see a slight elevation in nutrients with some wildlife if it's concentrated, but you're more likely to see nutrient increases around farm runoff and places where you have concentrated animals in a location. And then the other thing to put out like with those is like bacteria. That would be another parameter to assess there. And then, one of the things that we're finding with a new protocol that we've been developing is, looking at the impact of livestock on streams and just seeing the great benefits, and Maddie and some others can speak to this as well, of like what happens when you start putting in fences to keep animals out of the creek, because that's not only, having access to the creek potential nutrients, but you can also see impacts on turbidity and, the health of stream banks as well. But as it relates to these parameters and natural wildlife and forested areas, you're not going to be seeing a correlation with that to the parameters that we're developing. It'll be more associated with agricultural land uses.
Okay.